Well, welcome everyone to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts meeting on a remote location. I don't think we've actually been this far away from 87 Bernie Street. I have to say this is equally an adventure. We're here at the Revere Heritage Site in Canton, and we are talking about the creation of this new public history venue in the town of Canton. And we have a very distinguished panel here. First, I'll introduce George Comeau, very good friend, and George is the Marketing and Brand Activation Manager at the Downtown Boston Business Improvement District. That is, I guess, what we call your data. George is also a practicing attorney here in the town of Canton. He is driving force in Canton's history, historical society, historical commission, and he is also on the Statewide Historic Committee for the Community Preservation Act, as well as on the Town of Canton's Community Preservation Act. And that's one of the reasons we're able to be here. And George is also on the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners. In fact, he's appointed to the board by Governors Romney, Patrick, and just reappointed by Governor Baker, and served as chair of the Mass Board of Library Commissioners. He holds 3 degrees from Suffolk University. We met. That's where we met. We also have Rob Martello.
We need to speak up just a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we need to repeat what I just said?
Not at all. Well, me.
And Rob Martello is a professor of history, science, and technology at Olin College, where he has taught many interesting courses on technology, history. In fact, he holds 3 degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is unusual for an historian. I was training at MIT. He earned his PhD at MIT on Olin, and his book on Revere, Midnight Ride, Industrial Dawn, Revere, and the Growth of American Enterprise. Look at Revere in a new way. That is Revere the Industrialist. And he's followed up his work on Revere as the first thing he's famous for his work now on Benjamin Franklin. That's my new project. Benjamin Franklin. And Rob is no stranger to the Colonial Society. He's been a member for 10 years and also participated in our first graduate student forum in 1999. Lena Zannieri, far left. I don't want to say how long Lena has been with but she has been for 35 years the executive director of the Revere Memorial Society.
So you did say how long?
Yes. I'm sorry. Before birth.
12. I was 12 when I started.
Nina, for 30 years, has been a member of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. She's also been president of the New England Museum Association. She's been vice chair of the American Alliance of Museums, and she is really one of the leaders in Boston's public history community. So we have probably 3 people who know the most about Revere. Revere's many facets of Revere's life. And so with that, I will turn this over to George Comeau, who will tell us something about where we are now.
I wanted to start by sharing a quick PowerPoint so that people can get a chance to see this site. The topic of tonight's discussion is the site and why we're here, just to give people a bit of just an overview of life here in Canton. Because Revere came here, of course, in 1801, but he was no stranger to Canton, so he's been here when it was Stoughton prior to that during the American Revolution. So let me just share my screen for a second and bring folks through a very quick PowerPoint of the Revere Heritage Site. So this is as Revere found the site. The sketch at the top was done by Revere. Nina, what did he do? Do you know the sketch?
Around that 1801,
1802, something there.
Undated.
Early on, undated sketch, but in his hand, that's how this space sort of looked when Revere got here. By the time that we get through this process, the sketch on the bottom is from the 1880s, and you're sort of seeing the sprawling complex that sort of came from the original site. And then over to the right, that's the house that Revere lived in. It was a house built for an honest miller in the early 1700s. There's some Boston coming up, Miller. An honest miller, right? Honest miller. And Revere lived in that house and really spent from 1801 to 1818 splitting his time between Boston and Canton. When we found the site, it looked like this, and it's really remarkable to see this because you see all the way over on the left the building we're in today, which is, you know, pretty much in its factory state. You're also seeing in the middle all the penetrations to the building were bricked up, so it was a rolling mill factory, and you're seeing the extent of the industrial site in the two images on the right, and all of which is gone now. I mean, you'll see as we progress through the site that this is as we found it, and this is how it was progressing through this. There's also this barn over on the left here. That was built by Joseph Warren Revere in the 1850s. Paul Revere's son, who he left the business to. And so there was this period of expansion here at the project, at the site. And this was a working horse, draft horse barn for oxen. And then you're seeing a little bit more of the factory over on the right. And then below that, you're seeing us begin the process of picking up and moving the barn and starting to adaptively reuse the buildings. Again, some really nice shots of the mill, but again, if you take a look closely, you see no windows in this building whatsoever. You see no monitor at the top of the building. You're seeing a roof line that is basically just shingle, but there's a lot of fabric that is here. You sort of see the dragon's tooth crenellations at the top and the just this really amazing brick structure that was hidden over the years. And then we started, we got this project going, and there's our dear friend Nina right in the middle with Bruce Beckham, who's from Canton here, and basically you're seeing the genesis of the idea. What can we do here? And how do we put this together? And it was Nina that day who said, you know what, you need a restaurant. And so you're going to see how that played out over time. Here it is almost done. So now you're seeing the monitor at the top, you're seeing the facades and the gable ends fully brought back to life, and you're seeing the landscaping fit into the space, and found objects, anything that we could, bring into the project, we did. And here you're seeing a very large gear that was for a GE engine that ran the Banbury rollers that were in this building. Only probably 30 feet from where we're sitting today was this very large jet engine that powered this mill. And we're also in the bottom right getting a chance to see the new courtyard that was built into the space that is now host to a beautiful outdoor restaurant space. Again, remarkable changes in preservation. You're seeing a copper roof here that came from the Revere Copper Company in upstate New York, and getting a chance to see the monitor and the windows, and a lot of photographic evidence to help us suggest how to put this back in a place that that really helped the building resonate. Downstairs today and tonight, they're dining at Northern Spy Restaurant, a really amazing restaurant with Michelin chefs that are supporting that space there, and you're getting a chance to see the courtyard there as well. And then finally, you're seeing the barn in its current state, which will become a museum space. So that's really where we are today. And I'm going to just stop my sharing at that point and go back to this.
Wonderful. Thank you, George. And next, Rob Martello.
I would be delighted to go next. Right? So that's it. So first of all, I just want to say hi to everyone. It's great being back in this, in this virtual way with the membership. It'll be fun to do this in person, hopefully soon. It's also great to be on this location because we're walking in we're sitting, I guess, in the footsteps of Revere and his workers and the family members who work here. So I just was going to quickly offer us a little bit of context, and we can go into that, I guess, in more detail Later, there's going to be a question and answer opportunity if anyone wants to dig in deeper. But just a little bit backing up from the great story, right? Of, this location that we're in. How did Revere get here? I always like to start by saying that Paul Revere, lived this fascinating life. He lived a long life, almost exactly bisected by the American Revolution. So it's kind of fun to see the way that he went from, starting out in the North End to being this proto-industrialist. So we know Paul Revere as a silversmith, but often his history remembers him as the Patriot silversmith. He grew up and worked in the North End of Boston, apprenticed to his father. He was a silversmith of some renown, right, during his early years. He was very versatile. He was also very active in the Patriot movement. During the Revolutionary War and the resistance movement working up to the Revolutionary War, Revere had a lot of different experiences with different groups around Boston, well connected. He served the Patriot cause very faithfully. This is how we know him. He did not die. He did a lot of other typical activities as well. After the revolution is when the story sort of kicks into high gear a little bit. Revere really wanted to ascend into the upper levels of society at that time. And he was finding that his artisan status was not doing him any favors at that point. He was having trouble becoming a merchant. He had a failed military career in the militia, I guess, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts militia. He tried to get appointed positions. One effort after another did not succeed. As an artisan, he just was not able to cross that barrier. So in some measure of defeat, in his correspondence, he actually is sad about this. He returns to his silver shop, but with a new entrepreneurial approach. So he started by bringing in some equipment into the silver shop that wasn't there before, a silver rolling mill, which let him increase his output very dramatically. He had a lot more profits, a lot more goods. With those profits, he invested in an iron furnace on his property in Boston still. So the story is still set in the North End of Boston. The iron furnace allowed him to make cast iron goods that were serving the community in different ways than silver. This was no longer a luxury good. So he reached out to different aspects of the market there. He was very excited by the expanding scale of his business. At this point, he started bringing some of his sons in to help run different parts of his company. We were talking about Joseph Warren Revere. His oldest son, Paul Jr., actually took over the silver shop. So he's keeping his old businesses going while he's expanding into new ones. From iron working, he goes into bronze. He worked with bells and then cannons. So casting large bronze bells and cannons for churches and then later for the militia or for the federal government. That was very exciting for him. This is, again, remember, someone who was still a patriot at heart and wanted to serve his country and was kind of excited to be doing military contracting. He made copper fasteners for different ships at this point. Didn't have to cast it anymore, so he had just his workers producing large quantities. And then the endeavor that brought him here to Canton was something that he was learning about through his other endeavors, the idea that America was not able to make copper sheeting at this time. This was something important for naval vessels. Flexible copper sheeting that would protect the wooden hull of a vessel from the attacks of different sea creatures and like mollusks and different things like that. No American was able to make this. America was dependent upon Britain for this product. The Secretary of the Navy at the time wanted to break this monopoly, so reached out to several people. Finally, Paul Revere in the year 1800 was given a chance to try to roll this copper into sheets and start a new industry, copper rolling in America. So that was when he purchased some property here in Canton. The property had water power on it, and he erected a mill site. He used his knowledge from the earlier endeavors to figure out how to break into this new field, and he succeeded. Within 1 year, he was turning out large quantities of copper sheeting. He paid back a loan that he received from the federal government, a controversial loan at the time. And then after that, he produced an enormous amount of sheeting for different clients at the time. So I could go on all night, but I'm going to try and stop myself right there. Yes, with regret, right? But we could go into more. So Canton was the end of this long journey where he continued producing and expanding his output.
That's great. We are looking at a sheet of copper right across the room, too. It's amazing. Now, Nina Zannieri probably knows more Revere better than anyone.
Well, and I'm going to go in a little different direction because I want to, two things popped into my mind when I was thinking about what I would talk about. And one is that history is important, but it's also really difficult to do this work. And it's because, as shocking as it is to those of us who love history, there are people who don't care about history or old buildings. So it is our work to make that happen. I was also struck by the fact that each of us, myself, George, Rob, have had a personal journey that's related to this spot. My journey actually began shortly after I arrived at the Revere House. So I think even before George was really connected to the site, and it would start with phone calls. People would call and say, you know, there's a building down in Canton and they're falling down, and what are you going to do about it? You meaning me and the Revere Association. And you know, Plymouth Rubber was the owner, and they took over after the 1909 and the Revere Copper Company left. Plymouth Rubber came in, and Plymouth Rubber, I think they were aware that there were some buildings here, and I think they actually hoped some of them would be moved off the property so they wouldn't have to worry about them. But it really wasn't in their corporate wheelhouse to do anything. So again, I would get calls, and people would say there'd be a rumor that the property was going to be sold or a building was going to be torn down. And again, the refrain would be, what are you going to do about it, Nina? And at one point I said, well, I probably should do something. So a couple of my board members and my husband and I came out to the company. And while Charlie Dunn, God love him, and Paul Revere Jr. kept the guard busy, my husband and I snuck onto the property. And I went partway, and my husband, who loves this stuff, goes off into the bar and starts taking pictures. And I'm thinking, we're going to get arrested. It's going to be Paul Revere Jr. It's going to be the board and me arrested. It's going to be terrible. Well, we didn't. We got some good pictures. But again, what were we going to do? After Plymouth Rubber left, there were, again, rumors the property was threatened. There were concerns. We knew institutionally that the buildings post-dated Revere, so that was a part of a problem for us. However, we knew it was also always a Revere legacy story. There's a story about the Revere family. And over time, I began to realize that it was really also a story about the power of place, about the role of Canton, the Neponset River. There's a wonderful bird's eye view that shows you that this area was chock-a-block with all kinds of mill properties run by all kinds of companies, Ames, Kinsley, Revere. And that was also an important national story, but it was a uniquely Canton story. And it had to be embraced by the community. The role of the association, my association, had to be in the back seat. We could not drive the bus because we couldn't save it. It was not our job to save it. Ironically, I think Revere himself was torn, much as I was, between his Boston location and his Canton property. You know, he really wanted to be this mover and shaker in Boston, so he kept a Boston home. But he also loved to be out here at the mill. I know he did. He loved the activity, and he loved being out in a country gentleman. So it was that tension between Revere the mover and shaker and Revere the country gentleman. So in the end, really, what made this work was that the community of Canton, with George leading the charge and a number of other wonderful people, really made their minds up to make this happen. The importance of Revere's last chapter certainly has always been something that we've talked about at the Revere House, but it gets lost. It gets lost in the power of that Longfellow poem and the romance of the American Revolution. And this site really is a way to help shine a light on that last chapter and the importance of it. To Revere, to really share Revere's role as an industrial leader and Canton as an industrial leader. To me, it's more about place and interaction. It's a museum of complexity and dynamism and creative ideas. And you know, Rob certainly has spent a lot of time looking at the complexity of all those roles. Certainly, I walk outside and I think I'm torn between the fact that at some point there should be the hum of activity. There'd be the sound of hammers and workers coming and going and the lunchtime bell ringing. But it's also a place of contemplation. It's a beautiful site. Really a retreat, much as Revere thought of it that way. And I really couldn't be happier that I didn't try to take it on, even though I was torn, because it's happened the way it should have happened. The legacy, the place, and its potential has been embraced by the community. And that's what makes it a special place.
I mean, I want to sort of bookend that for a second, if I may, and that is, it almost didn't happen because this was an industrial waste site, brownfield at best. And one of the things that happened early on, if people sort of wondering how preservation happens, first of all, you need authenticity. And we sort of had authenticity in the buildings and in the presence of Paul Revere. But we also had a developer who wanted to build 600 units of housing plus here. And at the time, this developer paid cash for this property, which meant there were no environmental assessments because you didn't need to. If you had cash, you didn't need a bank, and the bank wasn't going to be looking over your shoulders for environmental assessments. But I clearly remember at the time, and these are stories you can tell today that you couldn't tell then, but I clearly remember at the time, two developers who had bid on the process all along said, let us give you the environmental impact reports and see what you're dealing with here. So we were looking for leverage to try to save the buildings. And originally the idea was, let's see if we can save the historic structures and the developer can turn them into a clubhouse or an amenity or a community center. We weren't thinking about it coming into the public realm. And so the developer filed demolition requests for this property. And myself and one other member of the Historical Commission said, if you do that, we're not going to allow you to rezone the property because it was all industrial. This was all an industrial parcel. And to build residences, highest and best use, you needed to have zoning change. And so the developer started taking down all the buildings and came very close to looking at these two. And we sort of stared down the barrel and said, if you take those down, you've crossed the line. Because at that time, we had placed the building on the 10 most endangered historic structures in the country. We were working with the Department of Interior. We were working with Mass Historical and Preservation Mass and saying, wake up, there's something really important here. We were helped by the fact that there was a plaque on the building at the time that said, in this building, Paul Revere started. Of course, now we know this wasn't the building, but it was the legacy, as Nina put it. And so we then said to the developer, we're not going to rezone the property. And the developer said, well, fine, I'll just put a large warehouse complex there and we'll just ship goods out of the site. To which we said, yeah, well, none of your tractor trailer trucks will fit under the railroad bridge down the street. It's not going to work. You can't put it. Industrial sites today aren't situated in places like this in the middle of, an urban setting. So there was this whole process, and that's when other people started to get involved. And I always bristle when people say, oh, you started this. No, because then other people came along. And once the train started to add more people, there was the Conservation Commission, there was the Planning Board, there was the Zoning Board, there were the Select Board. And other people started to say, okay, let's figure out how we can create a win-win situation here. And the win-win ultimately became a development agreement, very complex development agreement that rules the site even to this day. Also, the passage of the Community Preservation Act in Canton, which I know a number of viewers are very understanding of, allowed us to buy 7 acres of land to add to the 2 that we were getting from the developer. So today on the site, it's a 9-acre site with a beautiful park right along the Canton River that leads to the Neponset River. And there is that authenticity that you're walking in the space where Paul Revere, Joseph Warren Revere, and so many of the family really developed the site. So it was pretty arduous and it was very tricky. And the balancing act was 3 town meetings where at 2 points the zoning was turned down. And the developer finally got the message and said, okay, let's come up with something. And it was then the select board that negotiated an amazing agreement that even enabled us to preserve these buildings through a very complex tax incentive financing program that is very complex and is hard to put into place, but all the pieces fell in. So it was an amazing piece. And along the way, it was people like Rob and Nina who were the backstops. You know, you had done all this amazing research. So we knew so much more because of your research. The timing couldn't have been more perfect because you had been writing your master's thesis at the time.
PhD thesis.
And we got a copy. And we're like, oh my God, look at all this stuff, right? And so the more authenticity we got from your thesis, and Nina's support, because you had the day books, you knew what happened here. You know, it was really a good, the timing just was perfect. And that's why we're where we are today.
Well, and every step along those years, I was, as I say, getting those phone calls. And my friend Rob here, who came into my office as a graduate student and said, you know, I'd kind of like to do this work on Canton and look into and I was so excited because it was something that we wanted. And it was just you know, that's how these things happen. I mean, they are never one person. They're a mixture of things. And it's hard work. And I think that people don't always appreciate that these things take multiple years and all kinds of players and sometimes accidents. Things happen in a way because something changes or someone's mind changes, and you can be, you know, thinking that's it, it's just not going to work, and then something comes and changes it. But I really, really do believe that it was just so important that Canton as a community sees this as a multi-purpose place that can serve so many functions. And in the process, share this great story.
So
the story, I just want to quickly say, the story is so rich. I wasn't initially planning to make it my dissertation. I thought it'd be a nice article, and then there were so many connections. You can't tell the story without reaching into politics and economics. And so I'm just hearing your discussion of the property and the different connections you had to make in preserving this. And I was remembering, like, wow, as I was digging into the Paul Revere story, it's like, well, you have to talk about proto-industrial growth in America. And so now that opens up a door over here. And, oh, let's go into the artisan tradition. And suddenly it became a book, you know, so it's amazing.
But that's what makes the site special in the sense that so much happened here beyond Paul Revere. He created an industry where there was none. He used what we now call industrial espionage to build on technology transfer from other nations who were very much guarded in terms of their secrets, in terms of the process. So there's an international element to this. And then there's also just the tenacity and then the changes in the workforce. I mean, he really changed the way factories ran and was able to extend and create large scale output, where prior to that it was piecemeal, and basically was able to create and support the U.S. military through the creation of a Navy and naval independence, because it's all tied to copper and ships and shipbuilding.
Well, and I think Paul would say, I had a tough time turning this into a mill. So I hear you, George. I feel your pain. You know, it wasn't easy for him. He put money on the line. There were opportunities where things would not go as they should. Fighting with water coming down
water power limitations.
Just
a change in government administration, right? When Adams switched to Jefferson, suddenly a hostile climate from exactly so many hurdles.
Like lawsuits. You know, he buys the property and he thinks he has the water rights, and the person who sells him the property says, no, you don't get to do that with the water. So he goes to court 3 times, he loses, and then he says, well, to heck with it, I'll just buy all the water. And at that point, he starts buying all the water, which stays in private hands up until approximately 5 years ago.
So can you tell us what you mean by buying the water?
he bought the water. He physically went and bought the meadows that had been flooded to create the reservoir, to create the streams. He bought water in Sharon, where Ridley had a forge. He bought water at the reservoir here in Canton that had been in private hands. And then he controlled the water sources. Prior to that, he was the second to last mill on the water privilege. And so to create the headroom he needed to run the mill, he started futzing with the water. The person upstream who sold him this is like, what are you doing? You're affecting my business here. And they go to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court sitting in Dedham, and he loses. But he figures out a way to sort of push through it. And again, it's mind-blowing to me to think that we didn't have that public water until about 5 years ago when it was deeded to the town as part of the development agreement.
Wow.
And we got this piece back. So it had been in private hands. The Plymouth Rubber Company inherited it when they bought the water privilege along with the land, because Revere had already set that. The Revere Company had already had that in their portfolio. So when it went to auction in the early 1900s, it was an asset of the corporation, the water, physically. In fact, it was the company that would be responsible for lowering the locks and allowing water to flow and, dealing with flood control and all that. Ultimately, it's now in public hands again, just like these buildings.
Revere comes across as a pretty shrewd, tough guy.
Goodness, yes. It's an amazing story, because normally you would think if this was a family, because it's a family matter too. Some of the water, I think, was Joseph Warren, right? Who was or Revere was in the process of retiring when they were buying some of that water. But normally you would think the patriarch, right, of the family would be the one saying, "Oh, I was taught silver working. Let's stick with that, people." And then maybe the sons would be the ones saying, "No, Dad, come on. There's a new thing over here." Revere's story is the opposite, right? So he's the one forging it, right? So he's saying, "Son, you do the silver, I'm going to move to iron," right? And then once he tries that, I'll say, "Okay, second son, you keep the iron going. I think there's something to be done here in bronze," right? And he's always like the one in the front. And it's incredible, again, the way he's bringing these factors together. So you might think an artisan would be way behind the times in terms of labor relations, like, apprenticeships and all of these connections. Revere is the one who started to shift. He said, "Let's continue giving you room and board. It might be hard for you to acquire those things, so I'll support you. But I don't like the unreliability of the labor here. Let's talk about a daily wage for a day's work." So he's kind of blending old and new practices, extremely shrewd. That's why I call him proto-industrial, because it's not fully industrial. His son, Joseph Warren, kind of moves it across the finish line for that one. But that said, the transition is what was needed at that time. If he had just said, "I have a new idea, let's throw out all the old practices," probably labor would have left him behind. So it was like a very wise way to transition in there. And you could tell he was figuring out, I love the description of the water too. He was figuring that out as he goes, as were the court systems, right? When people were saying, wow, if you make a dam here, it's affecting the upstream and the downstream. Who gets priority? It was just going through the.
But I also love the part about the religious section of this too. A Huguenot, right? And here you've got Revere saying to his workers who are Irish Catholic, very nascent religion in the area, and he allows them to have a Catholic mass in his house. So there's this tolerance and support of the workers' needs. The work day builds the school, the housing for them, things that sort of spring out of the largesse of the factory owner, so they have better lives, which had not been happening.
He's a man with a chip on his shoulder. I mean, I think that is one of the things. Revere spent his life presuming certain things and then having them denied him. He felt he should be in the Continental Line. He didn't go to Harvard. He went to writing school. He has a terrible military career, really not distinguished at all. Never really gets the things that he wanted. And then he also has this wonderful soft side, this connection to his family. He calls his children his little lambs. He writes poetry to his wife. He writes a poem about the property here. And so he's constantly has his fists up, it seems. And I think that as he continued, and it was really in the Masonic orders where he was able to get those leadership positions, but he wants to be recognized as a gentleman. He wants to be recognized as someone who mattered. And he's often told he's not the right sort. He's just not quite where he should be. So a lot of the things that he accomplishes, I think, are him pushing back and saying, yeah, I can make a bell. I can roll a copper. I can do that. And then he does it. He figures out a way to do it. So he's a wonderfully complex man, and it's so often the case with these iconic heroes. They become kind of a cardboard cutout.
Right.
He becomes the lone rider of the midnight ride, when in fact he is this really important and fascinating character. You know, I've spent a lot of my life thinking about this guy, but he really is. And again, I think this is a place where people get an opportunity to see more of that other piece of him.
I always like the original deal, you know, that we've made unofficially, which is we get him at 1801. You've got him up until that point for the most part, right? Because I think it's important.
Then he dies in Boston, so we get him right.
Yeah, you get him back. All right. Well, but
Well done.
but we got Joseph Warren's house right in our backyard. So there's a lot to share. Is the point that the story is so complex that he deserves two spaces to be able to explore a life that is authentic and that is real, because, you know, as a colleague of mine, Bruce Beckham, says, Paul Revere after the ride. And, you know, you've said it too, Rob, that the idea here is that there's so much more to the story that can be covered in any one place, in any one book, in any one storyline. So that's the
contradictions are so fun. Like, like the one that you just mentioned, you know, I'm just thinking about the nuances there, where he wants to be a leader. He wants to be a gentleman. He feels like he's earned it. And he feels like he's smart enough, which is correct. Like he's realizing the things he's capable of doing. But he also loves rolling up his sleeves and getting into the shop and figuring out some new aspect of metalworking. And those two things at that time were seen as incompatible, right? Saying, oh, you're rolling up your sleeves, you got dirt under your fingernails. Okay, you're not leadership material, right? No, we've got some merchants and lawyers over here who we're going to go to. But in his mind, those two things should go together. I'm practical. I solve problems. I should be able to do this. So that's why it's so amazing here in Canton. At the end of his career, they both kind of dovetail together. I can lead and help our country by my technical work. Right now, I'm the one serving.
So I do want to point out for our audience that you need to type your questions in the chat. So some folks have raised their hands to ask questions, but because of the complexity of tonight's presentation and the remoteness, you'll have to type it. And if you type it, Bob will be able to read it. And
we can imagine Revere figuring out this technology and improving it, so it make it all work seamlessly.
Or maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe not, because we had a
He'd
little
have a hammer in his hand.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess
Gigi Barnhill has a question.
Okay,
so hopefully
go ahead.
She has to type it in first.
If Gigi types it in, we'll be able to see
so that. It doesn't work for Revere becoming a gentleman. What about the next generation? Joseph Warren, Paul Jr., are they more accepted as gentlemen, or are they still rolling up the sleeves?
I think Revere does make it at the end of his life. Not everyone would agree with that, but I think that's the case. And certainly, if you look at his children, the first of his children are the children of an artisan. The girls don't go to school. The boys train with him. The next set of children, Rachel's children with him, they get the opportunities of a man who has moved on. The girls get schooling. He has a son who goes to medical school and becomes a doctor. Joseph Warren Revere is well educated. So you can see in his own life, for a man who had a large family, that there is this dichotomy between the two chunks of his family. And that plays out in Revere's own economic and social status and his moving up. But I'm sure there were people in Boston who would not have welcomed, and I think his becoming Masonic leader also helped propel him there.
The other thing I want to point out on the questions and answers, and I'm sorry for these sort of technical, we don't get to see their questions, but if Mary will type them into the window, we can read Mary's questions. So Mary is communicating with us on our screen.
Wonderful.
It's like letter books.
So they're going to have to, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
But it is our first time trying it. So Mary put the questions in and we'll see them on this chat.
So Rob, you mentioned that he's it's a transition with the workers. So where are they living around here? Where do they live? Is he putting them up somewhere? Or are they worker housing, or are they people move to Canton to go work in the factory?
That's like, it's such an interesting question because it's a moving target, right? Over time, the answer to that question changes. And also remember, he still has some Boston work going on and the Canton work at the same time. So now I'm thinking back now to my grad school years, looking over the ledgers and everything. I do remember room and board comes up less frequently, but not zero, right, after he comes to Canton, right? So there's different contracts with different people. If I remember right, some of the workers live nearby, right, and they would be fine, right? He would pay them a wage and they would have some place to stay. But he was there to support them, right, if the need arose, right? That was what, and I remember that the religious aspects of that too, in some cases were more important than the housing.
Yeah, in fact, there are sort of Revere housing still on Neponset Street. You know, there's sort of row houses where the factory workers lived that are still part of the community's fabric. So that was provided as part of this. Plus, he used a tremendous amount of local. You know, I don't think it was an accident that he came here. I know how he found the space because he was familiar with it for sure because of the American Revolution and the powder mill that he oversaw here. However, I also think it was a perfect spot because of the Kinsley folks. There were metal workers already here. There was a labor force that was used to working with iron, and I think he took advantage of the work supply that was here as well. And strategically, Canton is located incredibly close to Boston, and yet he brought some of the operations to Point Shirley because it was so volatile. He knew that he couldn't do that stuff here. It also had access to the water. This is Joseph Warren at this point, right? As they expand, they are conscious of the things they need to make Canton work. And it worked up until they had to move to New Bedford, ultimately, as the company starts getting bigger and Canton just doesn't work for them anymore. So that I think was also very much present in their minds.
KPN wants to know how far into the 19th century the history in the exhibit runs, and it also wants to know what kind of marketing studies you did to find out what people wanted and how you could present it, and I guess what your overall vision is for this. I mean,
that's a great question. So first of all, the exhibit that's here today that you see in this room on the second floor, this is a exhibit that proves our mettle. We wanted to prove to the community that we could begin to tell a story in a way that elevates the story, that is not, you know, the 8th grade science project. You know, how do we really create something that is consumable? And so for 2 years, we worked to create a space on a very modest budget, by the way. So here we built an exhibit that is in what we were at the time calling the preview room. And that's where we are today. So we're previewing the future of a complex that includes a museum, includes the park, the public realm, the restaurant, all the components that are the Paul Revere Heritage Site. We worked with a company called Consulticon early on to understand what the economic impact of a space like this would be in this area. And so they produced a report for us that told us how many people to expect and how many buses and how many people would come to the space. And now we're in the process of updating that. We're working with Mills Whitaker, very familiar to the folks at the Revere House. I mean, it's a small town, right? So the experts that are helping us along the way are guiding us with really great ideas. And the master plan will be out shortly. We'll present that to the community and then to the larger community of, you know, historians and educators and other folks, understanding the pedagogy of what we want to show, what we want to do, and the events that we want to have. But it's all guided by experts who understand museums and understand visitation and what has to happen in a site like this.
Thanks. And let's see, Dick Brown has a question about Revere's gentlemanly aspirations. He wants to know if his federalism was part of that, or was it his maritime interests that drove his federalism? I think if I'm understanding the question right, what's motivating this? Because he has an economic interest as well as I guess, social interest.
Well, I'll let Rob talk to the political part because I disavow any knowledge of any political things. But I see it in Revere as a person who has a great amount of pride and self-confidence. And he does things. He's the person who does things and then expects that something will come back from that. Sacrifices in the American Revolution, doesn't get to be in the Continental Army. runs into trouble with that, comes back, runs the
Well, he lost
shop.
the
Discreet.
I mean, he did lose the Navy.
Contributing and doing things. He expects that, you know, when the government is started, he'll get something like the director of the Mint. He thought would be a great position, and he gets a letter back saying, well, Revere, you're really not quite the right sort. Between the lines is the answer to that. So then he thinks, okay, well, I'm Mason. I'll go up through, I have networks in the Masonic order. I'm moving up there. I'm someone that's known in the community. I do get this role to be Suffolk County coroner. So that adds to my resume. So at that point, he's beginning to make that transition, and he's also beginning to make it economically, because the silver shop helps to propel him into these other businesses. But he's also this risk taker. So, you know, how much is he risking where he's moved up on something like the copper mill? So I see it in personal terms. I'm sure there's also a political element to it, because that comes into play, certainly with the change from Adams to Jefferson, who Revere.
That's, yeah. Oh, there's a line in one of his correspondence that's something like, you know, this change in, and it's the word government was written, and he crosses it out, and then it's replaced by administration. Right? And it says, "What a dreadful change of politics!" Right. So he's just thinking about like this switch over. But you know, he was a federalist is the correct way to think about it. And that's starting from the Patriot years, right? Where, you know, and you could just read in the writing where this is someone who served the Patriot cause loyally, did everything that was asked of him. A lot of those were technical jobs too. Right? Like they always asked him to do these you know, clever problem solving things, and then he's kind of ready for the payoff at the end, saying, you know, we made this happen. All of those constraints that I felt before the war are lifted. Sky's the limit. Let's make this happen. And that was exactly when failure after failure. Right. So I like the chip on the shoulder phrase. Right? There's something about that. He remains an ardent federalist, right? And that's why to him, federalism is hard to distinguish from just the American government. So it's sort of like, we have the new government here, and you know, Washington was there. Now, you know, Adams is taking over. So when Jefferson comes like blasting in and like boots Adams, he just cannot. He's like, what happened to the country? I don't understand this. And so there's this real frustration. Plus, what in his business, what happened at the time was under the Adams administration, he was promised a loan. He was given a loan and contracts and things like that. He did his part of the thing, and he said, okay, by the way, I'd like to get the payment for the loan now. And then Thomas Jefferson comes in and says, we don't think we have the constitutional authority to give to loan money. That's not something that I believe in a limited government, so no loan for you. You know, and he had to fight for years, right, to get that. So
he took it so personally. I mean, he really saw it very personal.
Super personal.
Yeah, right. And I also just love how he invested himself in the local community. You know, the Deborah Sampson, you know, case, you know, bringing that petition up for her. And, you know, all his friends are here. So he's really exposed to sort of both sides of this, you know, trying to get largesse for himself, but also providing it for others.
And that's that warm part of him, that piece. He had a son-in-law who had a mental illness and was abandoned by his own family. He took care of him. So he had this, you know, ability to be warm and loving and outward. Sometimes in his businesses, he seemed very inward. You know, if someone wants to move up the ranks, it sounds like, well, that's someone who's prideful and has a big ego. But he's got this other side to him that really, he's a wonderful family man. He takes care of his family. He cares about his family, and he cares, as you say, about other people in the community that either had been wronged or not treated well. Because I think that was in his own view of himself, that sometimes he had not been treated well, so he was not going to do that to someone else.
Ben Edwards asks about Revere's house. You mentioned Joseph Warren's Revere's house. Do we know where Revere lived? Is there anything left of his house?
Yeah, Ben, it is actually the remnants of it. The house fell into disrepair in the early 1900s. And at the time that Plymouth Rubber picked up the property, it was considered a liability. They didn't tear it down. A small fire came into place, and they thought, all right, let's just raise this house. I believe what happened was people carried off some of the, you know, a lot of it was used in other places. Because there's folklore here where people will say, you know, we've got some of that timber in our house that, you know, came from the Revere House. It's just sort of passed on over time. Whether it's true or not, you know, how do you know? It's
George,
timber.
I used to get those calls.
You get them too, right? Yeah. We've got a Revere spoon,
Can you
right?
verify
No.
this 2x4?
Can you come look at our
Can you
house
come-
because we think we have part of the
Pieces of the house.
Yeah.
But what we do know, which is really kind of amazing, that nothing was ever built on that portion. And so when this site was developed for today, we marked it off. We have a sense of where that is, which yields amazing archaeology to come in the future.
So it's close to where we are right now.
Yeah, right on the corner of part of the there's nothing on it today.
Okay.
Just we planted over it, right?
Mhm.
Because the idea was to be able to secure it for archaeological resource recovery, so that we could tell the story, run some workshops in the future, and the future could be 5 years, it could be 50 years, but it doesn't matter. As long as we pass it forward and say, it was in this location, this is where you need to start doing your work. And that's how that will play out. And we allowed, we have a conservation restriction on the 7+ acres of land that was purchased by the CPA money for the community. And we built that into there to allow for archaeology on that portion of the site, so that we could recover some of these pieces. So we don't know exactly, but we know approximately.
So can you tell us, someone who wants to come visit, what they will see, what there is to do here?
Well, as you know, it's hard to find at night.
At night.
Bob pulled into the parking lot 2 seconds before we turned this on, right? And telling tales out of school.
George, I don't think that's a marketing.
No,
but we're working on it. That's the point. We're working on all those things. You know, we always say in the corporate, there's a corporation now that the legislature helped us create. And what's great about this is our president of our corporation is sitting here in this little mini audience that we've got in the room. The wonderful thing is we are starting to move from crawling to walking. And so we're building in the marquee signage that will have to come, the wayfinding that has to come, the website is being built up. And so people can visit it today, however, and plan, a couple of hours and have lunch at Northern Spy, walk the grounds, and there's wayfinding and interpretive signage already on the site. So you can walk through these paths, all of which are accessible, by the way. So it's all easy to sort of, if you are disabled, you could wheelchair, all of it is built into the site in terms of the thinking that the community has put into this. So the investment to interpretation has already been underway. And we have a very dear friend here in Canton. Some of you may know Emily Priggett, who worked for the National Park Service, who we work with very closely. And Emily has helped us guide the wayfinding signage and the interpretation of this. So we have great minds at work putting this together. So people can come to Canton and come up under the Canton Viaduct and come up the road onto Ponce Street, and then you'll start to see the complex and just come in over the bridge and visit for the afternoon.
And there's a restaurant downstairs.
Great restaurant downstairs.
We can hear it.
Yeah, Northern Spy. You can hear them downstairs. It sounds like we might need an airlock over here or something. Yeah.
And are you envisioning have school groups and other kinds of ways of using the space in an interactive way?
School groups, special events, weddings, fairs, colonial and otherwise. You know, I mean, the idea is so new that we're sort of building in these pieces. You know, we're running the car and still building the engine, right? As a lot of these organizations have to do. And there's no shortage of ideas. And we're working on making sure there's no shortage of money too. It's a very expensive venture to sort of build in over time. And so we have to build a pattern of giving. We have to, you know, recently we're happy to announce, again, through the partnership with the Revere House, we've discovered somebody who has a Revere bell. And Nina says, well, we already have a bell, so we don't need another bell. How many bells can you have at a complex? But we needed a bell. And so we've got a Revere bell coming from California. That was cast here on this site in 1830.
Wow.
Getting it from, you know, LA to Boston is the next challenge, but we're working on those things. It'll be here.
Great.
And it's great. It's it was a really happy thing for us to be able to, again, answer the phone and turn it the direction it needed to go.
It also, the Revere connection is so important that the donor said, to me on the phone recently, you know, George, I was offered $30,000. I could sell it to a rancher in Texas, but we don't think that's the right answer. We think the Revere legacy should be where people study and learn about Revere, which suggests it needs to come back east. And I assured her, I said, that bell was cast yards from where it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so she says, we're sending it home,
Yeah.
which is really remarkable.
That is. That is. Can you remind everyone of the address for this?
I don't know. What's the address? What is our address officially? 4 Revolution Way.
4 Revolution
Keep
Way.
in mind, Google still has to catch up with the new roads that are built into this complex. I tell folks 2 things. If you put in 99 Revere Street, that's the fire station, and the access road is across the street from the fire station. Or you can come up the Ponset Street and you'll find a big bridge next to the site, and you can come in that way there.
Or I'll give them your number.
Yeah, you can give my number because I went out
I
and I was like, "Can you see me? I'm over here." And he pulled in.
I'm glad my wife's not watching.
Yeah, no. I'm going to tell her how you got here. Do you have a GPS?
Yeah.
Bob?
Yes, I
Boy,
do.
this is talking about personal journey.
That's right. So Rob, let's get to your person.
Bob, have you been here before? And he said, well, the daytime. It's different at night. He's right.
So how did you get onto Revere as a subject, someone you wanted to study for your dissertation?
It's very funny because I'm a historian of technology. So I was looking for early American stories and something with crossover appeal, you know, where you would not be studying something obscure, but rather something that people might connect to and be able to understand. When I first heard of the Paul, and I was talking to my advisor, Merritt Rose Smith, right, great historian of technology, he said, Rob, there might be something in the Paul Revere thing. I'm not sure. Yeah, he did more than just silver. And I said, oh, great person, but how much is there?
Yeah.
And I mean, he now still teases me about that conversation. Like, do you think there's enough to write a whole paper about it? Like a whole 20-page paper? He's like, you'll never know till you look.
So Rob, when did it tip? Because you started the research. Was there a tipping point?
Looking at the poem, I thought I was going to tell a quick story. So my original conception was, hey, we know him as a Midnight Rider. He did more than that. He worked on some cool stuff after that. And then when you say, oh, but in doing so, he was initiating a big shift in America, right? And I don't want to overstate this one small company, right? He was one of many who was doing this, but he was making this transition. It cast into question, a real tipping point might have been the role of the government for me when I was thinking, well, no one talks about the government sponsoring and fostering technological innovation at this early time. Yeah. It started me thinking about the Industrial Revolution, right? Saying, could you make a claim that the Industrial Revolution is kind of beginning at this early time? It's a hard thing to pin down a date on something like a revolution. It's a long process. These questions were something, the idea of technology transfer was a big one for me too. Revere was basically what today we call reverse engineering the British product. Yeah. So again, typically we say, oh, someone smart in Britain snuck into America and brought the knowledge with them and started something. And here it's like, no, here's an American who moved knowledge from one field to another. You don't hear that story at all. So this moved it from like small paper to big paper to dissertation to book. Like
the other piece that's remarkable is that the family understood the legacy and the paper still exists. So Mass Historical Society has reams of microfilm that is the operating part of the complex that was here in 1801. So you have stacks of stuff to look at because the family preserved it. And when Margaret and Anna Revere were preparing to sort of leave the earth to die, they had already decided where things were going to go. They carried the legacy. And a friend of mine who had visited their house at one point said, everything's marked for Museum of Fine Arts or wherever things were going, because they knew that they were passing this on to further that they really do feel the gravity of being a Revere. And even today, Reveres that serve on your board feel this. Well,
and even going back to the house being restored, and you have Pauline Revere Thayer, who is a 18-month-old baby when her father dies at the Battle of Gettysburg. Her father is Joseph Warren Revere's
That's
son.
right.
So you've got these long and compressed generations in a way. And Pauline knew, I think, that by saving her Paul Revere's house, she was allowing for her own father's story to be told. That Civil War story.
Right.
And they she republished a memorial that was all the letters that came back and forth between Paul Joseph Revere and Edward H.R. And so there is this sense that the family, like so many families, have all of these chapters and stories. And for them, there was an opportunity to save all these different stories by preserving the Paul Revere House. And in a way, Margaret and Anna were very much a part of that as well.
And they're really still with us because they're buried at the Canton Corner Cemetery. You can go to the Revere plots at the Canton Corner Cemetery and really, get a sense of that history. And I believe a Revere was buried there even quite recently. So they're
Paul Jr.
Yeah, Paul Jr. was buried in Canton at that space, and the family comes here, which is really always wonderful. Sometimes they'll come in the middle of winter. You get a call, and we'll walk them through, and that's always really amazing to us that they carry on that name in such a wonderful way. And so we're so pleased that we can now augment what you've been doing for over 100 years.
Well, it feels like 100 years.
Yeah. No, not you, but yes, but the association. Yeah. Well, maybe I don't know.
Went by in the blink of an eye.
And you look great.
Well, it is great that you're all carrying on the story and telling it in different ways, adding new pieces to it. And, we could, actually, the four of us might spend the rest of the night talking about Revere, but I know other folks have lives to get back to. So I want to thank everyone for joining us with the Colonial Society. And I want to thank George Comeau and the folks in Canton for creating this project, and Rob Martello for telling the story, and Midnight Ride and the great book, and Nina for what you do with the Paul Revere House in Boston. How long did Revere live there?
He lived there off and on. He owned the house for 30 years, and he lived there through various parts of that time.
So there are more places for those who want to explore the life and legacy of Paul Revere House in the North End, Rob Martello's book, and now here in Canton. So thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So